Do thoughts originate in our minds?
Wow, that's a good question, isn't it? The mind, in my mind, is the portal, the passageway from which thoughts get manifested or expressed and experienced. They sort of bubble up and arise from the field of intelligence.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Ask Julie Ryan Show. I'm so delighted you could join us. My intention in doing this show is to provide information, insight, and comfort to people all over the world by helping to answer life's unanswerable questions. We have Tom Cronin with us today. Hi, Tom.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me along today.
Well, thanks for joining us. We're getting to talk real time in my future because I'm in the United States and he's in Australia. So it's afternoon where I am and it's morning where he is, which is it's like we're talking at a time warp, Tom.
Yeah, I'm actually ahead of you in time, which is quite an interesting phenomenon.
I know. Time machine, not a time warp, time machine, I guess. I had somebody say to me the other day, when you change time zones when you're flying, it's like you're in a time machine. You can leave one place at 6 o'clock and get in the next place an hour later at 6 o'clock. Yes. I said, I never thought of it that way.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Makes sense, yeah. Tom's a meditation and transformational coach. So that's why I wanted to have him on today so that we could pick your brain and get all kinds of useful information to help us live better lives. You say the state of consciousness we're currently in is a distraction. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, we are very much magnetized and pulled by enticing and luring things outside of us. And the iPhone, the Samsung, our smartphones are one of the biggest attractions for our mind's attention to go to places that it finds curiosity, intrigue, and charm. And what that's doing with our Netflix, our Spotify, our phones, all of the things that are constantly pulling our attention outside of us is that it's giving us less and less propensity and less inclination to explore within and what lies beyond the thinking mind, beyond our emotional fluctuations. And that's leading to immense distraction and an immense level of ignorance, that not ignorance in that we're stupid, ignorance in that we're ignoring a part of us that is an essential part of us that we must give it more attention if we really want to find true fulfillment and true peace and true happiness. And that's the inward space.
Do you think we're more programmable in doing all that technology that we're doing? If you hear the conspiracy theory people say, it's just all part of the narrative and everybody's buying into the narrative. And it's because we're all on our technology so much. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Look, we're always programmable, always have been, and always will be. AI is programmable, humans are programmable. The social indoctrination that we've had just simply by being in a particular family, in a particular city, in a particular school, in a particular social economic environment, all of that influences the way we think. If you grew up under the Taliban in the remote mountains of Afghanistan and never went to university or had access to the internet, you would have a very different way of thinking than if you grew up in a right-wing Christian family in Ohio. And that's not right or wrong. It's just that just shows you that your way of thinking is very habitual and it's very conditional and it's very conditionable. And that means we can get easily influenced and programmed. And we're always getting programmed. The way we generally think is a big part of the influence that we've had in our life. And also the program that we've indoctrinated and basically the program that we've inherited through our genetics. Quite often someone will say, oh, you sound just like your mother. You sound just like your father. And that's because you didn't just pick up the hardware code, which is the shape of your nose or the color of your eyes or the color of your hair from your lineage of your parents, but you also picked up a software code, which is the way you particularly think. And so we've got social conditioning happening when we're born, and we've got social conditioning and sort of programmable conditioning happening before we're born, which is coming through our bloodline.
That makes me think of a situation where one of my girlfriends, when her daughter was born, she's adopted, and she was from a Sikh family, so she had an Indian accent. And they got her when she was 2 weeks old or something like that, and have had her. Now she's in her early 30s. But she had pictures of her birth parents. My girlfriend had pictures of her birth parents on the refrigerator door. And the baby would look at the pictures and she would say the names with an Indian accent. And she said, this child had been, around us since she was teeny. How did she know to speak with that dialect, with that accent, with those certain names? Because it didn't come out with American words, but it came out with those names that were Indian names. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, fascinating.
And I thought, well, it's because she was listening to her birth mother in utero, is what I thought. But it sounds like maybe there's more to the story than that from what you just said.
Yeah, absolutely. A big part of our personality is a genetic disposition. You'll see particular tendencies that you might have that are very similar to your mother or your father, or you might even have skipped a generation. You might see similar tendencies that might be in your uncles or your aunties, or it might be in your grandparents or great-grandparents. And that lineage that's getting passed down, when the sperm and the egg come together to create the embryo, the code that gets inputted into that embryo from the sperm and the egg is a genetic disposition that's being passed down. So we do have a lot of nurture, which is happening in our life after we're born, but we also have a lot of nature that's getting inputted as well. So those two things, when it comes back to that original question you're having about programmable, yeah, absolutely. We are programmed, and we're easily programmed. It's natural for us in our society to think that it's normal to go to a pub on a Friday night and get drunk and let our hair down. We think it's normal to watch violent films that have, predominantly most of our movies, have some form of someone killing another person. And we think that's normal as a form of entertainment. We think it's normal as a form of entertainment that most of our video games have someone with a gun killing someone else. That's a deep indoctrination that's programmed into us. It's not our natural state, it's a programmed state. And so all of this means that the good news is that we're reprogrammable, which we can change. And this is a big part of what the film The Portal is about, that we can see that when we liberate ourselves from, these are called vasanas in Sanskrit. A vasana is a tendency of the mind, habituation of your mind to have a particular thought form or a belief system or an ideology that is conditioned. And we have the capacity to unravel that code and create new code if we wish to, and if we're interested in doing that.
Well, you mentioned the portal. Tell us about the portal.
Yeah, the portal is a big project that I undertook a few years ago, which was the intention to showcase through a medium of film and literature, film and book, of the power of meditation to liberate us from a trajectory that we might be on that's led us to crisis or is leading us to crisis, through that indoctrination, through that coding and that program. And so you could have someone that's really difficult childhood, really traumatic experiences that could put them on a trajectory in their life that leads to more crisis and more, trauma and more negative experiences. Or we can actually pivot from that particular trajectory and create a new trajectory that we feel more congruent, more empowered, and more sovereign in. And that meditation being one of the tools that we find very effective and very powerful at doing that. And so I really wanted to showcase through 6 real life stories that have had really difficult experiences, crises of some sort, that enabled them through meditation to liberate themselves from the ongoing binding effect of that experience, and then to start to create their own successful life through their own choosing, and not be owned and conditioned by those traumatic experiences in life. Because quite often what we find in the world at the moment is, I've had trauma, therefore my life will continue to have trauma, and that experience of trauma will continue to affect my life. And what we're sort of suggesting here is there is a possibility, and it's not going to be easy for some people, but there is a possibility to free ourselves from that past experience and create a new trajectory for life.
All right, we will get into that in a couple of minutes. See, I'm getting all tongue-tied. I'm so excited for you to share some of the tools to do that. But I got a couple of other questions for you that'll lead us up to that. When people experience one with the divine spirit source, whatever you want to call it, what's happening there?
What a good
question. A lot of
question.
the time it's in meditation, but sometimes it isn't. What do you think's going on?
They're experiencing what is already true and is already there. it's the analogy I like to use for my students is if there's only thick black clouds in the sky, and then one day the clouds just disperse and melt away and reveal blue sky, someone will say the sky has changed. The sky was always blue. We didn't suddenly get blue sky. We just revealed what was already there by clearing the veil that had been masking what was behind the clouds. And so with something like meditation, we de-excite the mind and get out of our thinking mind, which is the programmed self, get out of our emotional body, which is the reactions to the thinking mind, and we get into a subtler level of quiet consciousness. Some will call it presence or source or the divine. What happens when we transcend the world of individualization, separatism, and form, we experience what is inherently already there at the subtlest fields, the subtlest being it's beyond physical form and phenomenon. And so now we're getting into a layer of reality that exists at all times. And Einstein talked about the unified field theory. We're exploring other sort of quantum sort of concepts now and starting to see what ancient mystics and, quantum physics are starting to reveal at the same time, that this essence exists. Now we give it sort of cool spiritual words like the divine or God or the higher self, yet it's really something at a science level. It's just the field of formlessness and the unmanifest. But we're becoming one with that.
What's the unified field theory for those that don't know?
It's the idea that there's a expansive field that pervades all things and that everything is part of that. And so there's actually a great scene in I Heart Huckabees that explains this very well with Dustin Hoffman, where everything is actually the same, but it looks and is perceived to be different. And we know this now that we've got incredible capacity to get things down into subtler and subtler levels beyond the atoms and the molecules, and the quarks and the leptoquarks, and realize that there's nothing actually solid, that's all part of one interconnected woven web.
Of energy.
Yeah, of energy, that's right.
Yeah, of energy. You're known as the King of Calm. How'd you get that title?
Oh, I did a speaker training course actually. And it was a 3-day boot camp on how to improve our speaking capabilities and get speaking gigs and get into agencies. And it was a very efficient and effective training program that I went through. And we had to present at the end of the course one of our keynotes. And they introduced me because of their way of interacting with me and the way they observed me at that particular keynote that I had to present at the end of that boot camp as the King of Calm. And I think that's kind of stuck because it's in my sizzle reel now.
I love it. So Tom, how'd you go from a career in finance to being a meditation and transformational coach? Tell us about your career in finance, and was there a catalyst that got you to kind of switch gears to go into what you're doing now?
Yeah, if anyone's seen Wolf of Wall Street, they will have a little glimpse into what my life was like in the late 80s, early 90s. I entered into the finance industry as a broker, very much what Jordan Belfort was doing in his life in those times. He started his career in 1987 at the age of 22, and I started my career in 1987 at the age of 19. And before long, I was under the bright lights and the fast-paced lifestyle of being a broker on a massive trading room floor in a global finance markets. And I was trading swaps and bonds. And it was kind of the Wild West back then in those 80s and 90s. And there was very little regulation and it was kind of anything goes. And so before long, I was doing lots of drugs and drinking and partying and very much caught up in a narcissistic, hedonistic lifestyle. And, it's easy when that's presented to you at a young age that you get very enamored by that. And the good thing is that your body has this capacity to guide you and remind you that there are certain things that it likes and certain things that it doesn't like. And it uses symptoms as a way of signaling to us that there are things that it doesn't like. And so what it started to present in my body was a lot of anxiety and panic attacks and depression. Now, I didn't know that this was a signal from the universe or my body to try and help me to navigate a different way of living. I just kind of battled on through these ailments that I had. I was just sort of struggling a lot with life. I was getting more and more depressed and more addictions and more anxiety, more and more panic attacks. I didn't even know what a panic attack was. I just kept these waves of fear and dread that would be very, very debilitating, curled up in a ball in my bed, not able to go to work, or having to go to the cubicle in the toilet at work and trying to get my breath and, stand up because I just wanted to collapse on the floor. And this culminated eventually as I continued to ignore those signals and those symptoms. And eventually that led to full-blown nervous breakdown in in the sort of mid-90s, my late 20s. And it was a really crushing day in my life where I became really quite uncontrollable, a bit of a basket case in some respects. At that point in time, I was seeing doctors and psychiatrists and contemplating whether I wanted to continue living my life. And then that's when I came across, maybe it was divine intervention, who knows, a documentary that I was watching at home. I was struggling with agoraphobia. So for those people that don't know what that means, it's the inability to leave the house. My nervous system was so overwhelmed with the proposition of going outside the front door that I just couldn't face any of those demands. And you develop this sense of agoraphobia, wanting to just stay in a very small, confined, safe place. So I just stayed at home. I took mental health leave from work. And I saw a documentary while I was watching TV, and it kind of was an awkward time back then because there's no internet, no Netflix, no Foxtel. So you're just watching a lot of free-to-air TV. And there was a documentary of a property developer, and he was in one little segment of that story, he was meditating, and he was doing transcendental meditation. And that was a real epiphany for me. I'd never come across it, didn't know anything about it, but it looked really good because I showed him meditating, and he was in a suit, in a chair meditating, not in robes and not lotus position. So that was really appealing to me. But he looked so serene, and it was so far from my world at that point in time. But it was like a light bulb moment that that's what I wanted to experience. And so I did something really wacky for the young kids. I went and picked up the Yellow Pages, which is what you would call Google these days. And I started searching for meditation, and I started then at that point learning to meditate. And it was absolute game changing for me. It really did turn my life around very quickly. Fast forward, I went back into my job and continued on for many years. And eventually I decided that I had a bigger and better calling in life, and that was to become a teacher. And I did my teacher training and then started teaching. And that's how I transitioned out of being a broker in finance to being a meditation teacher.
How was it when you went back into finance once you added the meditation practice to your, what was it, a daily routine? Or
Yeah, it was twice a day. I was meditating 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes in the afternoon. It's one of those things with transcendental meditation or Vedic meditation, it's also called, is that there's a sort of very much a protocol that they recommend. And I like to be told what to do. I'm very good at taking instructions. So if someone says, this is how it's going to work, then I'll do it. And so I was very good at following that instruction, and I found phenomenal benefits out of it. But it was challenging, to be honest with you. It was, quite confronting because the lifestyle and the personality that I'd become pre that, I call it PM, pre-meditation, and post-meditation, or after meditation, PM and AM. And in my pre-meditation world, Tom was the crazy badass dude. And, I was kind of like one of the ones that would be leading the way when it came to going crazy and wild. And so I didn't find any temptation or charm in that world anymore. I didn't want to get wasted. I didn't want to lose consciousness because I was finding the power and the beauty in being more conscious, which I was discovering through meditation. So taking drugs or drinking wasn't something that I wanted to do anymore, yet most of the industry was built on that particular lifestyle. So I had to find a new way forward in that industry, and it was challenging at first to reestablish myself. But over time, I just found a way to take things in a different way, do things in a different way, particularly when it was around entertainment, so taking clients to yoga and surfing retreats, or taking them and their wives to nice dinner or the ballet or the opera or things like that was a new way of adding value to their lives rather than making a mess of their lives.
Yeah. And it is somewhat disconcerting. And I'll be eager to hear your take on this too, to think, okay, how much of that still goes on? I'm sure plenty of it. And these guys are dealing with massive amounts of money in the global markets. And you think, okay, really? Somebody that's got that much going on, and their brain obviously is not operating at an optimal level that really has control over that much of our financial well-being. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, it's an easy target to pick on a particular industry like that one. However, having been in the space that I'm in, which is mentoring, coaching, and helping people over the last 10 years since I left finance, one thing I've discovered is that it's not isolated. Our society is riddled, coming back to the distraction disease that we're in, and self-medicating and medicating to try to find our way through life is a huge part of our society right now. And I want to make an impact to dent into that world, that being a normality is something that we should start to question. So it can be the trading industry, most of them will knock off work and go to the pub, the law industry, the accounting industry, the banking industry. It's just rife across our society. And so, it's something that as a species, we need to really start looking at what it is to be fully realized in our true potential, and what are the options that we can choose, the options we can take to live a better, healthier, more sovereign and more empowered life.
It seems too that things have gotten worse for a lot of people, especially teenagers, since the COVID situation. And especially in Australia, I know I have a lot of clients that are in Sydney where you are, and also in Melbourne. And Melbourne really was locked down, I know, as far as big cities throughout the world. And we're seeing an increase in people really suffering. Why do you think that is? What was the catalyst with COVID? Just the separation from others?
Yeah, I think there's two big factors at play right now. One of the major factors at play is social media. As social media is exacerbating the existence of our ego, getting likes, comments, being seen. These are things that kind of fertilize the ego. And then when we fertilize the ego, we become more identified in our own personality, our own individualization, and our own neediness that exacerbates all the characteristics that are in the ego, which is insecurity, self-doubt, self-sabotage, emptiness, loneliness, lack, all those sorts of things. And so we crave those ways to fill those holes that the ego has. This is the challenge with the ego, is that it will always have those holes. It will always have lack. The ego will never be fulfilled. And what's happening in our world is that we're having an inflated ego, which is leading to greater levels of narcissism, which leads to greater levels of unhappiness. And that leads to obviously more and more ignorance of what is our true nature, which is our divine essence. COVID just kind of put more fuel on that fire. That's all really that happened, because, we had to resort to other forms of entertainment than the few that we had left, which was going out and hanging out with people and going to sport and things like that. So we were left with just Netflix and social media on our phones, and it was a recipe for disaster. And I think it's interesting, we just had this week one of the remaining premiers of our states, or the leaders of our states, resign. That means that there are no premiers now left that are in power that were here during COVID, which was only, last year, 2 years ago. And it makes me wonder why they're all leaving now, just before we're about to start looking at some big questions asked and inquiries starting to happen around the handling of some of these situations, because I think there was such extremity and overreaction. I know that there was some things that they had to make decisions on and some difficult choices that they had to make, and I can't imagine how hard it would have been to be, leading a large group of people through those difficult times. But there was definitely some major collateral damage that we had to experience as a result of some of those decisions.
And still going on in some instances,
absolutely.
too.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think too. Yeah. Let's change directions for a minute. Do thoughts originate in our minds?
Wow, that's a good question, isn't it? The mind, in my mind, is the portal, the passageway from which thoughts get manifested or expressed and experienced. They sort of bubble up and arise from the field of intelligence. So the first analogy that comes to mind is that this phone that I have isn't the source of the internet. It's the device that has the capacity to take the information from the internet and deliver it so it's receivable. The information from the internet is always here and it's all around us. It's all around you. It's all around me. If I'm in Antarctica, if I'm in Bali, if I'm in Venezuela, it's all around us. This is just the access point for which I can now take the unmanifest and non-form aspect of the internet. It might be here, but I can't grab it. It might be here, but I can't grab it. I can't access it. I need a mechanism for me to then access it and pull something that's quantifiable. So it might be some lines on a page that is the request that I've given it to access that information. Can you give me a recipe for chocolate cake? Now the recipe for chocolate cake is here, but I need this device to access. And I think the mind is like that. It's the capacity to access that field. Now, here's the thing. We have the field outside of us, which is infinite creativity and infinite potential. And there's infinite number of thoughts that are in this field that we haven't had yet. And all creation, this mouse was not manifest unless it was cognized first. So it had to be a thought before it was a mouse. This had to be a thought before it was a set of glasses. The design, whether it's going to be black or blue or red, whether it's going to be plastic or whether it's going to be timber or wood, what type of glass are we going to put in there? And so everything that is cognized, everything that's manifest is cognized first. So we've got this infinite field of thoughts, potential in the field that's not a thought yet. And then the mind pulls the thoughts. But we also have within that, we have the conditioned mind as well, which is the nature of our thoughts in the mind. And so it's going back to the phone. The phone does have an operating system inside of it as well. So it has access to the infinite internet, which is outside of the phone, but it also has a coded system inside of it, which is the iOS, because it's an iPhone. So the iOS is its operating system. So we do come into this world with a software code, and the thoughts do emerge from that mind, but we also have unlimited access to thoughts outside of the mind. And meditation is an important tool to access that field. And so a lot of my students will go, oh my gosh, I got so many downloads during that meditation. And that's because they got out of the vasanas, which is the coded mind, the iOS operating system, which is I'm no good, or I'm unworthy, or I'm better than someone else because I'm this color or that, that level of wealth, whatever that indoctrinated code is. And then we have creative potential, which is outside the mind. I hope that answers your question.
It does. It's been my experience, and the analogy that I like to use, Tom, see if this resonates for you, is our heads are like big satellite dishes. They receive and transmit frequencies. Every thought has a frequency. Every spirit has a frequency throughout all of their lifetimes. So in order for us to think of something and pull in information, we just need to be on that channel, whether that be a radio station or a satellite station or something like that. And then it, similar to a two-way radio, opens up the information flow. And then to piggyback on your iOS analogy, I believe it's emotion. When a thought comes into our head, it's neutral, and then we assign a meaning to it. And the meaning is based on our beliefs, most of which are limiting beliefs that are false. You're not worthy, you're this, you're that, whatever, that we've picked up perhaps through genetics, like what you've referenced earlier in this conversation, or somebody, a parent, a grandparent, the media, a school, a friend, whatever, has kind of programmed us. And then we can decide, okay, does this really make sense? Does this really resonate with us or not? So I think we're saying the same things, just a little bit different semantics, perhaps.
Yeah,
but
really
it's all in the energy field, and it's all available, and we pull in those thoughts. So if you're thinking about inventing a new rose bush, you're thinking about rose bushes, and maybe you're researching rose bushes and you're researching how to cultivate rose bushes and all of that, but you're also on the rose bush channel, which is going to allow you to access universal intelligence. On rose bushes, in a lot of instances, perhaps something that nobody's accessed before in that way. And then the difference is if you act on that, then that helps things materialize. Does that resonate with your understanding of that?
Yeah, I really like that you brought energy and frequency into this discussion, because while you were speaking, I was thinking, that if you take AM radio and FM radio, AM is a very low frequency and it's very dull. And that's why we don't have really much music on AM. We just have talkback. And on FM, we have a higher frequency. It's better quality. And so we have more music on those channels. And I was thinking that our energy can also influence and affect the nature of our thoughts. So if we're in a really low frequency vibration, that is, we're in guilt, shame, misery, fear, anger, then our tendency to have high vibrational thoughts, which are thoughts that lead to high vibrational feelings in our body. So, connecting with the divine and thinking about incredibly creative projects or exciting propositions and beautiful belief systems around your magnificence and gratitude and sending lots of love to people. It might be incongruent if you're on a low frequency to have those types of thoughts. And so it's going to be a lot easier to have thoughts that are much more negative and lower in density, lower in frequency than the higher frequency thoughts. So I think there's a lot to be said about that as well. So I think there's a few things going on. I don't think it's a very simple answer to the question, but I think there's lots of layers of complexity in it. And one of them being that we have feelings in our body or frequencies in our body that can also influence the nature of our thoughts as well.
Oh, absolutely. And then the feelings that feel badly are based in fear, all of them: anger, jealousy, boredom, grief, whatever, actual fear. And when we're in fear, what happens? We're in a fight or flight. When we're in fight or flight, we lose clarity because the blood drains from our brain, goes to our heart and our extremities, so we can escape whatever the perceived threat is, even if that's being late to a meeting. It's still, the body doesn't know any differently. The other thing that I say a lot, Tom, is spirit doesn't communicate on the I feel crappy channels because the vibration's too low.
So true.
You gotta raise your vibrational level in order to get that guidance and those thoughts that are gonna help you manifest things that are gonna be wonderful, instead of continuing on this cycle of things that are perceived to be negative. So yeah, it's interesting. It's all about the frequency. I think Einstein said that. It's all about energy and frequency. Everything is. You've taught mindfulness meditation to employees of some of the biggest clients in the world. I love this: Amazon, Coca-Cola, UPS, Qantas Airlines, etc. So how did you get those corporate suit guys to incorporate meditation into a program that you presented to their employees? When I read that about you, I thought, oh, I can't wait to ask him that question.
Yeah, interestingly, a lot of it's word of mouth. I just go about doing my work, which is using a mechanism, meditation, to help people find what is inherently already within them, which is high vibrational love and spirit and divinity, or also bliss, love, and joy. And that has a phenomenal effect on people. When I get them to quieten their mind and quieten their nervous system and quieten their body, we start to find that they start to find their life changes quite dramatically. And then as a result of that, those people that I teach all tend to work in organizations. And you've got to come to my company and help our staff, and you've got to come and speak at our conference. You've got to come and do a talk. Most of that has been simply because people have been experiencing the work that I do and want me to take it to the next level and come into their organizations. That was how I managed to get Amazon, Qantas, Oracle. Some of them were through speaker agencies as well. So I'm registered with some speaker agencies. So quite often a gig will come up that I'll be booked on, and that I'll go and turn up to some of those organizations. But a lot of it has been through word of mouth.
I'm thinking, how's he getting this past the HR department of a bunch of buttoned up suits going, meditation? That's nuts. We're not bringing that in here.
Yeah.
But that makes sense. If you've got somebody then in a high enough level position that can override that and say, hey, we need to bring this guy in here and have him talk to our employees, and then it spreads from there.
Yeah, look, one of the biggest challenges that these organizers are all facing, which is the same as society as a whole, is that their staff are extremely overwhelmed. There, one organization I was talking to, the HR department, and they and one of the C-suite people was in that meeting, and he'd had to talk 3 people out of committing suicide that were just staff members. And so we have a an epidemic of stress in our society. Even the World Health Organization has said that, and these organizations are looking for an antidote to that. And a big part of my pitch to the organizations is that your success is dependent upon not your logo, not your PE, not your share price, not your products. Your success is based upon the number of people that walk through the front door of your building and turn up to work every day. And if they're compromised, like you said before, if they're compromised in a state of stress, that's going to affect their brain. It's going to affect their capacity to think creatively. It's going to affect their ability to turn up with less absenteeism. It's going to affect their relationships. It's going to affect all areas of their life if they're riddled with stress. And so if they want greater success, they have to really start looking at reducing the stress response in their staff. And meditation is just a really effective way of doing that.
Well, and I think we don't get away from work now with the cell phones and the, all of that. It used to be back in the day, people would leave the office and they would answer phone calls when they'd come back the next day, and they would answer letters and things like that. And emails certainly make it easier, but it has created a lot more work for those of us that remember before we had emails. I remember when I got my first fax machine, I thought it was magical. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not going to have to race to the FedEx. By 5 o'clock, I was living in Los Angeles at the time when I got my first fax machine. And I used to have to be to the FedEx office by 5 p.m. so they could get the packages to Memphis so they could be distributed elsewhere in the country. And I remember when we got the first fax machine in my office with thermal paper. You couldn't take it outside because it would turn dark. It was hilarious, but it was magical.
Yeah.
And I think that the 24-hour news cycle, too, keeps people in it's kind of even if it's a low level of stress, but it's just, okay, here's what's happening. And if it bleeds, it leads. They're not going to report stuff that's good. You may have a million people travel on a highway to get to work and there's one accident. They're not going to report on the 999,000. They're going to report on the one that was the accident. So I think that leads to a lot of stress too. Would you agree with the 24-hour news cycle?
Yeah, I think both of those things are major factors. There's this polarity in our world where we have these incredible efficiencies being introduced to our society, which is emails have made life very efficient for communication. But at the same time, I received an email from my banker on a Sunday night, and I sent them a reply. I said, well, why are you emailing me tonight? They said, well, I just wanted to get ahead of my workload on Monday. It's like, that's what Monday's for, is your workload. And so that intrusion into our personal and recreational life from work through emails and phone calls and WhatsApp, etc., has removed those boundary lines. And now it's just a mishmash of personal life and work life, and now there's no real sort of segregation. Also, of course, exactly like you said, social media particularly, I opened up my Instagram this morning and just had a quick scroll through a few feeds, and it was 90%, mutilated babies and mothers being killed and bombs going off in Middle East. And so, this barrage of information, of tragedy, and it's, we need to be informed. We really do need to be aware of what's going on in the world. It's just that how much do we need to know all of that information? It's this really fine line we're walking now, where this obsession 24/7 with news, and news, as you said, if it bleeds, it leads. Most of the news that we're getting obsessed about will be news of quite tragic situations in the world. And where our attention goes, it grows. And it's one thing to be informed, it's another thing to be obsessed. Because if we keep putting our attention on negativity, then that's what we'll keep experiencing and watering and flourishing in our life. And there's a saying, we don't want to water the weeds, we want to water the roses. It sounds a little bit ignorant. You can't just ignore the difficult situations in life. We definitely need to be aware of them and do what we can to support a better world. But we also want to make sure that if we come out of our house with a hose in our hand and water coming out of it, and we stand looking at the weeds all day long, and we ignore those roses, then those roses will die and the weeds will flourish. And so we've got to be careful how much we give attention to in our world at the moment.
Do you have a routine where you look at emails for a certain time period during the day? Or I have a friend who says he doesn't turn on his phone or his computer before 10 a.m. He works out, he does his meditation, he does all that stuff. He said, I don't want that interfering into my personal space. Do you have some kind of a routine like that you follow?
Yeah, it's been proven that boxing, and you can just Google boxing, not as in punching something, but boxing your day. I think it was from Amazon or one of these big companies. They found that when they got their staff to box their day, which is creating little boxes of time and compartmentalizing things, we become much, much more efficient, which is why when we went to school, we had geography in one subject. And then when the bell went, we went to English. And then when the bell went, we went to maths. We compartmentalized what we were doing. We weren't doing maths, geography, and English all at the same time. And this sort of idea of multitasking at the moment, doing lots of things all at once, is not very efficient. So I do like to box my day and compartmentalize windows of time. I like to start my morning with some form of movement, which would be some yoga and some exercise, going to the gym. And then I'll do some breath work and I'll do some meditation, potentially some journaling as well. So it's kind of like a standard sort of morning routine that I like to do quite early. I get up around sort of 4:30, 5 o'clock to get that routine happening.
Wow. What time do you go to bed?
I go to bed around 10. I'd like to go a little bit earlier, but I've got a family with two 21-year-old kids. So we all like to sort of hang out. So I compromise a bit to spend more time with them.
Well, yeah, because they're going to be gone pretty soon. Then you're going to be able to go to bed at 7:30
right.
if you want at that point, right? Yeah. All right, let's switch into meditation. Can everybody learn to meditate? I think a lot of people have the misconception, in my opinion, of meditation's really hard and that you have to do it a certain way and you have to do it for a certain number of minutes or hours a day. Talk to us about meditation in general and what you recommend.
So meditation is a man-made tool. It's or human-made tool, I should say. And it's a device or a process for us for various reasons. And there's many different meditations, and it really depends on why you're doing that particular meditation. You could do a meditation to manifest more money. You could do a meditation to heal some sickness. You could do a meditation to sleep better. And so there's different styles of meditation, and some are going to be definitely harder than others. Some meditations that the primary intention of the meditation is to still the mind. And I always ask people, why do you want to still your mind? And they're like, I don't know, isn't that what I'm supposed to do? And I ask, yeah, but why? And they don't really understand the why. They just think it's something that they should do. So the technique that I chose to use after doing lots of research, and as a result, the technique that I chose to teach, was one that used a mantra that made the process of meditating much, much easier. The reason being is that the mind doesn't want to be still. The mind has no interest in being still. The mind is only primary focus is to actually find and follow charm. And so thinking for the mind is extremely charming. Worrying for the mind is extremely charming. Analyzing, regressing, forecasting, these are really, really interesting and charming propositions for the mind. And it will do that all day long. And then if you put an iPhone in front of it or a smartphone in front of the phone, in front of the mind, and give it something to entertain it even more, like TikTok or Instagram, the mind's like a kid in a lolly shop. It's just like in heaven because it's got so much information that it can devour. So it doesn't want to be still. So we just try to force the mind to be still. You will experience discomfort. You will experience some form of, some people even report stress because you're forcing one thing to do, something that it doesn't want to do. It's like trying to tell a 4-year-old kid to sit still. It gets uncomfortable and fidgety, and it's almost uncomfortable for it. So the mantra plays a very effective role in inspiring, luring, and enticing the mind to the subtler world. Rather than going outward to stimulation, the mantra takes the mind inward to quietness. And that became a very easy and effective way to meditate by using a particular repetition of a sound, a mantra, that inspired the mind inward to quietness. And then what will happen is, as the mind goes deeper and deeper and deeper, quieter and quieter and quieter, away from forms and phenomenon, away from excitation, it eventually gets to a degree of blissfulness that's so alluring and so pleasant and so appealing that the mind surrenders the mantra and it surrenders any thinking propositions, and it then becomes still because it's found the sweetest bliss of all, which is transcendence. Now the mind spontaneously becomes still, which puts the body into a really deep state of rest. So that's the technique that I've been practicing and teaching for a long time now. There are many other forms, of course, visualizations, gratitude, focus meditation, mindfulness meditation, mindful of how you're walking, mindful of how you're eating. I like ones that take me into really deep transcendence because it gives me a deep physiological rest, but also it gives my mind the ability to expand beyond the thinking mind and get into the field of mind, which is the field of conscious awareness.
I want to get to what you experience when you're there. But before we get there, I want to know your thoughts about how ancient this is. I'm thinking Gregorian chants, the monks in Tibet. I'm fascinated with, they can be sleeping in a snowstorm without any blankets on and they keep their bodies warm. By meditating, they can raise their body temperature. So even if it's a sub-zero temperature outside, their body stays warm. That's fascinating to me, that the mind has the ability to do that with meditation. Where's meditation from? You say it's man-made. Certainly the meditation the monks are doing and the Gregorian chants and the other chants that different people have been doing since the beginning of time. Where do you think that originated? Have you done any research on that?
Yeah, it seems from the research that I've done that it traces back to around at least 7,000 years ago in the northern parts of India in the Himalayas, or the Himalayas, some might say. And many traditions, the Christian meditations, the Buddhist meditations, many of the other traditions, really many of them can be traced back to that original source of what we call the Vedas, a vast body of knowledge that incorporated techniques as well as philosophies around the science of life. And these modalities were cognized by ancient seers and sages that there was a capacity to experience a state of being awake and not thinking. And they realized that there was processes that you could use to get the mind into that field, which you wanted to explore in a moment, that field of being awake and not thinking, and what that experience is like. And they realized that it was almost like, hey, there's blue sky behind the clouds. I'm not the thoughts and I'm not the feelings. I'm not even the physicality, even though I have thoughts, I have feelings, and I have a physicality, but there is something else here. And they just realized that there was a process that could get them to that experience. And so it can be traced back around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago in the Vedic tradition, in the sort of up in the Himalayas. And from there, it kind of grew and spilt out. And we have limbs of Buddhism. Some would even suggest that Christianity and some of the Christian tradition was emerging out of the this lineage of the Vedas. There's 18 years of Jesus's life that's not been documented, and there's some studies and some research proving that he had spent those 18 years from the age of 12 to 30 traveling further from the Middle East to the East, where he started to do some of these incredible practices. And of course, he's been known to say, "Be still and know that I'm God." So he did practice a lot of deep stillness and contemplation.
Well, and that I was going to bring that up. So great minds think alike.
There you go.
That's like a missing big chunk of Jesus's life in the Bible. Either somebody threw it out and they didn't think it was necessary, or there was some part of it that wasn't reported. And I too have heard that. I've even heard that that Jesus's triple finger sign is Kundalini energy. I have a friend who's a yogi who told me that one time. And I thought that was interesting. I think, too, prayer is a form of meditation. Do you agree with that? Certainly the prayer beads and the rosary. I went through 12 years of Catholic schools, was raised Catholic. And the rosary is ancient. It way predates Christianity. And that was a way, kind of like a mantra almost. They were saying the prayer. They were touching the bead. It was giving what you were talking about earlier, the mind, something to focus on, to let that other information come in. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I have interesting you brought up the rosary beads, and I grew up a very strong Catholic, and we had rosary beads in our house. And if you look at the rosary beads, these are mala beads, and the mala beads have 108 beads, and they have the lead bead there as well, which is the starting point of your mantra meditation.
Yeah.
So, that would go through the 108 beads, and that usually do that 10 times. And that was a form of sort of repetitious meditation. And then if you look at the rosary, which is just a very similar version and form of that particular recitation and repetition, very beautiful practice. And unfortunately, what happened with spirituality and religion was a bit of a split. And there was, interesting, you mentioned something, was it taken out? Yeah, there was a Council of Constantinople in 600 AD. There was a bit of a clearing of the Bible where they took out certain references to some of the spirituality. And religion then, from that moment, went from a beautiful spiritual practice of embodiment, where you live and breathe the embodiment, to have the Christ consciousness being expressed through you, to something of separation, which is bowing down and separating us from this beautiful, rich power that we have within us. And that's when religious indoctrination became a lot of separation, a lot of segregation between different religions and their gods. And that is when, if you look at most of the world's conflict and most of the world's mayhem, you'll find that religions, unfortunately, were at the core of most of those. And still today, we see religions still causing huge divide and conquer. And that's because we've lost that component of embodiment and the practices that enable us to actually experience the living and breathing of that God consciousness in us. And that's what's really important. And that's where hopefully we can bring religion and spirituality back together again, where it actually started in the first place.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think the rosary too, and I've done this myself many times, where you got 10 fingers. So if you don't have a rosary, you can count and say the prayers on your fingers. So I've done that a few kabillion times.
Myself included.
All right. So what do you experience when you're in the, transcendental state? Do you have, I call them divine downloads, where I get information from spirit and I'm like, oh, that's cool, and then it like gives me information to go follow. But what do you experience when you're in a deep state of meditation?
When we're in the deepest state of meditation, which is full transcendence, the experiencee, that is me or you, is no longer there. So that duality of me experiencing something doesn't exist. What exists is just a beautiful, vast, quiet, spacious field of blissful lovingness, I guess, is all that prevails. And it's so profound and so pure that when we start to get more and more familiar with the journey into it and the ability to stabilize in that for longer periods of time, it becomes such a magnetic and profound experience that it's very hard for other things to supersede that, because the heightened level of ecstasy and bliss that's in that state. At the same time, it's also very quiet and peaceful. And we can get profound downloads on the way through in deeper states, not the deepest, but deeper states, because that's in the field where we've got the ability still to get cognitions and downloads and creative impulses and creative impressions. But we can get that on the way down, we can get that on the way out. But when we're in that deepest state, which is kind of finite, where there's just no thoughts and there's just this beautiful, vast, blissful peacefulness that prevails. And we can be in that for long periods of time over time as a more advanced meditator.
My husband has a family member that was really involved, still is, with the Maharishi when he was alive and lived in some castle in Switzerland and stuff like that. And my mother-in-law went to visit her there, and she would meditate for 8 hours a day. And she would levitate. She'd be in the lotus position, and my mother-in-law said they'd have him in like a padded room, because it wasn't like they just float like a genie, but it was more she would hop around the room. But she wasn't aware she was doing it. They could film her doing it so she could see it afterwards. But she would do that almost every day when she was meditating. What was happening with that? Have you heard of that?
Yeah, this is a very advanced program called the Cities program. And they also call it yogi flying. And it's an advanced program that gets added to your daily meditation practice that activates what we call siddhas, which are these advanced capabilities that are in all of us humans. It's interesting that our entire Christian calendar is built on the idea that a person could come back to life after dying, or could manifest loaves and fishes, or could bring people's eyesight back. So these, it's intriguing and curious that there's capabilities within humans, and some will say that's an exception human, but we know through a lot of research that many humans have had these sorts of capabilities. It's just that we haven't really explored them. We haven't really tapped into them. It's just that we have really dumbed ourselves down and densened ourselves through this bad diet and bad food and negative thoughts and, association and attachments and news stories that are all about negativity. So we're not really optimized as a human. But when we do start to go through certain modalities and practices and look at anyone we call it the 10,000 hour principle, which is from Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Outliers, that if we allocate larger amounts of time to certain things, we'll get better and better at it. We've just become really good at shopping, really good at drinking, really good at gambling, really good at scrolling through social media feeds, really good at watching the news. And so that's just where we've spent our 10,000 hours. But there are a small group of people on the planet that have spent 10,000 hours doing other things that activate and enliven superhuman capabilities. And I think we're going to start, as a species, start to look and do more research into this. And it's really exciting that it's not an accident that all of a sudden we've got breath work coming into our mainstream. We've got plant medicine, we've got yoga, we've got meditation. These are ancient practices that have been around in jungles and ashrams and monasteries for thousands of years. And it's a really exciting time because now they're starting to be embraced and absorbed and integrated into our daily lives on a bigger level. You're in the USA and I'm in Australia. We're having this conversation now. So technology is giving us this capacity to spread and share the power of these things. And it's exciting what could be possible for humans when we start to give a little bit more attention to this.
I agree. I teach people all over the world what I call my buffet of psychicness. I say I'm a businesswoman who learned how to do woo-woo, and I'm a buffet of psychicness. So that means I can scan somebody anywhere in the world. It's like I have an MRI screen in my head. I can see broken bones, torn ligaments, viral infections, facilitate energetic healing, talk to any spirit, whether it's attached to a body or not, tell how close to death somebody is, talk to a pet, do past life stuff. And this is all stuff that we all have the capability to do. I learned how to do all of this stuff, and now I teach it. And to your point, the one thing that I say to my students is, you've got to practice it. Practice, 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 practice. The more you do it, the more validation you're going to get. The more validation you get, the more you trust it. And then it's just second nature. I probably talk to 3,000 people a year because I do it for a living, but that's what the bottom line is, whether it's meditation, whether it's jumping around the room, when you're meditating, like my husband's cousin does, and things like that. I think it's all about the hours, the Malcolm Gladwell concept. It's what are you focused on? Can meditation help people heal? Can it help people sleep better? Can it help people live more joyful lives?
Yes to all of those. It's not a cure-all. It's not a, one-hit wonder, and, it's not going to fix everything. But it certainly can contribute to improving in many aspects of life. And the body is an incredible intelligent system, and it has incredible complexities, but simplicities as well. And one thing we know that if we can get the body into profoundly deep states of rest, even deeper than sleep, and we find that when we measure the body in deep states of meditation versus unconscious deep sleep, we find that the level of rest is up to 4 times deeper in deep meditation than it is in sleep. And that gives the body this capacity to start to really heal itself in a big way. So we find a lot of people, in fact, I got a message from a woman yesterday that was my student of 6 months ago. And she has had and suffered for many, many years, over a decade, from chronic Lyme's disease, which led to all sorts of other inflammations and horrible dispositions going on in her body. And she said that she's seen not only a gradual progression in her health and well-being, but she sent me a message last night saying that she's gone through some significant shift in the last couple of days where her health, she knows, is not a fluctuating good health and bad health. It's like, I know something has been reset here, and the meditation has played a critical role in this healing process. And she says, it's like nothing I've ever seen before. Even the doctors who are reducing my medication week after week now are just blown away by what's actually happening here. And we call it miracles in some respects because miracles has this sense of ignorance about it. We don't understand it, so we'll call it a miracle. And I think as we evolve and grow and learn and research, we'll start to realize they weren't miracles, they were capabilities that we'd yet to understand.
I agree. I get calls from doctors when their patients go back in to see them and there's something that's been healed that's supposedly unhealable, and they're doing the scans on them. They're going, okay, what are you doing? And how does this stuff work? And then I explain it to them. And I don't know that they buy it, but it's kind of hard to argue with the results when they're looking at the scans and they see that something's been healed. When somebody's working to perhaps heal their body, is there a certain time period that they need to meditate? I know you said earlier in the morning and at night is optimal, but like for 20 minutes in the morning, for an hour in the morning, is there a time that you would recommend that would be kind of an average for somebody to shoot for?
I think depends on the practice and what they've been trained. I don't want to override a particular teacher's teaching of what that person's been through. I do recommend finding a qualified teacher and learning a particular style of meditation rather than just trying to wing it and, do a YouTube or an app or something. It's actually be with someone that's qualified and experienced in this realm, and then taking the guidance from them. What I recommend to my students for this particular style of meditation, Vedic or Transcendental meditation, is 20 minutes morning and 20 minutes afternoon. The dipping in and dipping out is an important part of the process, because if you take a needle and a thread and you take a piece of cloth and you put that needle down through the cloth and then back up again and then back down again and back up again and back down again and back up again, what we're doing is we're weaving into the fabric of your consciousness and into your vehicle, your body, this experience. And so that regularity of coming out of the deep quietness and stillness and bliss of the meditation back into activity, there'll be some eroding and some fading of that deep peacefulness. Then they'll be back into that meditative state again. So for me, I recommend 2 shorter windows of time rather than 1 big long window of time to be a more efficient way of meditating and a more efficient way of integrating. Because what we want to do is really integrate not just the meditation experience in meditation, but the meditation experience outside of meditation, so that we have this 24/7 and we can get called the King of Calm or Queen of Calm.
What a great analogy. I love that with the fabric. That's really profound. That really, when you were talking about that, I was getting goosebumps, which just means, okay, that's coming from the divine. That's like, aha, he's on that.
You can use that.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's calling to mind to this conversation, John. I probably, 30 years ago was at a lecture with Herbert Benson, who was a physician at Harvard. And he was one of the first ones I ever heard that talked about wellness medicine, and meditation was such a huge part of what he was teaching from wellness medicine. And that was really the first time I heard that from a physician saying, you got to incorporate this, especially if you're trying to heal from something. And I hadn't thought about that talk. I heard him at Vanderbilt University in Nashville at a symposium, and that's coming back to mind here. Okay, let's see. You teach gratefulness, a gratefulness meditation. Why is being grateful so important?
It's really a powerful energetic shift that happens when because we can always find problems with our life. There's no one that will have an experience of life, not one person that will have an experience of life where there's something that's not meeting their expectation or something that's not satisfying their desires. And so therefore, because the nature of our world currently is to move our attention to the things that are the problems, the pains, the difficulties, which is why we sell news the way we sell news. And so we naturally tend to look at the things that aren't, the best part of our life. It's actually really hard for us to see, as well as that, yes, that is there true. But as well as that, wow, I actually had a fresh running hot shower this morning, which some people don't have, and some people many, years ago, decades, hundreds of years ago, never experienced. I had the ability to press the button on my toilet that actually took the effluent away. Like, that's phenomenal, right? I didn't have to take a bucket and go and empty it somewhere in a trench outside my house and let it stink and smell. It just disappeared phenomenally. Like, that's almost like magic. And then I had 3 meals. Like, I didn't even question whether I was going to have enough food today. And, that was a really interesting, only this morning, how appropriate. I watched a reel that was on my socials, and they interviewed 5 children from America and asked them to list one thing that they would wish for. And the American kids, and this is not to pick on America, I'm sure it'll be the same with Australia as well. The 5 American kids would say, one said $1 billion, one said $1 trillion, one said $1 million, one said a Nintendo, and the other one said something like an iPhone. And then they interviewed some children, and this is not to get political, but they interviewed some children in Palestine. And one of them said, I want my father to come back to life. One of them said, I want my brother to come back to life. One of them said something about more food. And, it was just really interesting to see the differences. And I think it's really important for us to just stop and realize how abundant we actually are when most of us just take things for granted. It could be that you spoke to your mum today. I mean, even the fact that the sun gave us sunlight and warmth and sustained our own existence. A tree, we couldn't live without them. We couldn't live without fungi. We couldn't live without bees. We couldn't live without the ocean. And, all of these things are part of an interwoven web that sustain and enable our existence. And yet we're usually completely oblivious to it. Even myself, I have to remind myself, hey, dude, did you thank the sun today? Did you thank those trees today? They gave you oxygen. They cleared your carbon dioxide. So we have this symbiotic relationship happening all around us, and yet we're so oblivious to this life-sustaining support system that we have, that we're so obsessed about trying to get more. And that when we have gratitude, it raises our frequency and it helps us interconnect. And we see this reciprocation start to happen. We'll find, interestingly, more abundance coming into our life when we acknowledge the abundance that we already have.
Ditto. Well said. Agree, concur with everything you just said. Gratefulness is a high frequency vibration. I do it all day long. I've been known to be in the grocery store, and thank the cashier and thank the stocker for working today, the one that's filling the shelves and stuff like that. And their face just lights up. They're like, oh, thanks. Wow. Well, every once in a while they'll say, well, I had to come in. And I said, well, I just really appreciate you being here. And, you put a smile on somebody's face, and how wonderful is that? Makes you feel good, makes them feel good. It's all good. And then every night, those 10 fingers, I do 10 things that I'm grateful for before I go to sleep every night. And I'm counting them off on my fingers and doing that as well. What is the Stillness Project? Couple more questions. What's the Stillness Project?
Yeah, it was a vision I had with a group of brains that we were sort of collaborating when I came out of finance, and we really wanted that was sort of advisors and consultants, and I was looking to establish a brand and a business and a vision and a goal. And we came up with this idea to, they were sort of probing me, what's your passion? What's your mission? We want to get your mission statement. And I said, look, the thing that I think I could do the most to bring about change in the world was to inspire more people to sit in stillness and meditate. Now, thank goodness we've got other people doing things like saving whales and saving bees. But my goal and vision and skill set that I could contribute to the world was to inspire people to meditate. I could see that that would bring about a big shift in people's lives. And so the Stillness Project was born, and the tagline for that was to inspire 1 billion people to meditate daily. And it was a project that's will no doubt keep me going for the rest of my life. My retreats, this podcast alone is all part of the Stillness Project. It's not like a structured, formalized business model. It's more like an intention of mine that will be something that I will continue to work towards for probably the next 50 to 60 years of my life, hopefully.
Wonderful. Last question. Why do we incarnate?
To fulfill our desires. Every desire.
Where did the desires come from?
Yeah, the desires come from the longing within us to realize our true nature. However, our desires get misguided. We're seeking what we already are, the unmanifest created manifestation, to experience the extension of itself through form and phenomenon. And we got lost in the idea that we were the original source. And so we are in this quest to find that again, to remember, to remind, to reconnect. However, along the way, we go looking in places that we can't find that, because we go looking for the quickest and easiest route to fulfillment, which is the candy, the KFC, the Netflix. And so we have these desires, which is, as I think Deepak Chopra once said, we're in an ongoing process of exhausting and refining our desires. And eventually, as we continue that exhaustion of desires and refinement of desires, we'll start to move our desires to the reunion with God. And that's just an ongoing process until we conclude our requirement to reincarnate and fulfill desires in the earthly dimension, the physical world. It's funny, I was talking to a coaching client yesterday, and she said, Tom, and she's a spiritual medium, a very highly spiritual person. And she said, I'm just finding it harder and harder to be fascinated and curious and enamored by the 3D world. I'm like, yep, I understand that.
Yeah. Well, obviously you're being led to do this. You just your path of what you've told us in this conversation, I think it's easy to see how you've been led. You've been led. And when we know what we don't want, it helps us create what we do want, which you did initially, and then to parlay that into helping others. And you're obviously being led to serve the masses. So on behalf of humanity, thank you for that. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And thank you for helping all these people around the world to tap into their inner wisdom and to connect to the divine and whatever they want to call it. How can people learn more about you and your work?
Where can they find me? At Instagram, Tom Cronin is the main place. I love to receive messages from people. I always check and respond to all my messages. I don't have a bot or a VA that's doing that for me. So Instagram, Tom Cronin, one word, and then my website, tomcronin.com. So very simple.
All righty. Well, everybody, thanks for joining us, Tom, especially you. Thank you for taking the time to share your wisdom with us. Everybody, we'll see you next time. Sending you lots of love from Sweet Home, Alabama. Mwah! And from Sydney, Australia, too, where Tom's just starting his day. So we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to follow Julie on Instagram and YouTube at Ask Julie Ryan, and like her on Facebook at Ask Julie Ryan. To schedule an appointment or submit a question, please visit AskJulieRyan.com.
This show is for informational purposes only. It is not intended to be medical, psychological, financial, or legal advice. Please contact a licensed professional. The Ask Julie Ryan Show, Julie Ryan and all parties involved in producing, recording, and distributing it assume no responsibility for listeners' actions based on any information heard on this or any Ask Julie Ryan shows or podcasts.